Hello everyone, welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. Today I'll be continuing on with Deku and Death. This will be part 16, chapter 16, entitled, Once the Coin is in the Air, You Realize Which Side You're Hoping For. The silence was eating away at any leftover confidence Midoriya had. No one had said a word since his declaration, not even Nezu, which, quite frankly, unnerved him. Had he said the wrong thing? Should he have just kept his mouth shut? His self-doubt was invading his consciousness like an aggressive virus. Nezu was aware that he should probably speak up to avoid any sort of angry opposing debates from his staff, as well as to reassure the boy's dwindling confidence. But his morals had long been twisted, and although he would never admit it, seeing the kind that had once enjoyed his suffering now squirming under him brought a sick sort of satisfaction to his brain. The principal often fought with himself on this issue, especially now after he had met Midoriya. He couldn't lie. He did enjoy toying with humans, but messing with the reserve student didn't feel as good as messing with his staff. Maybe it was because the two had similar upbringings. He was able to deduce that pretty easily on the second day, where the teen was hospitalized after the training exercise. But that didn't explain all of his strange behavior. Unfortunately, though, that was a thought to ponder at another time, as he could tell his staff was beginning to grow quite restless. How could you possibly tell this was decayed based on some flimsy facts? Vladimir questioned cynically. His arms were crossed to buff up his figure. The intimidation tactic was clearly working as the boy slinked back, huddling in on himself. Gami growled protectively, taking a menacing step towards the blood hero, but thankfully someone else intervened before the ghost could attempt to get physical. Actually, Powerloader spoke up, surprising even Nezu. That's not a far-off conclusion to draw. Vlad, along with the other heroes, quickly turned their attention to their fellow comrade. The hero took a few steps forward to inspect the metal himself. Taking in a good whiff of the air, he stepped back and nodded almost immediately. Metal has a distinct smell to it due to high potency of iron, the support teacher explained. You can actually determine an accurate guess of the method of destruction from the smell alone. I'm actually inclined to agree with the kid. The 1B teacher huffed and prepared to refute the claim, but Nezu had enough of the pointless arguing. That was the exact conclusion I was reaching as well, the rodent laughed eerily. Though I would say the dust surrounding the barrier is a large giveaway. That seemed to finally shut up the rest of the staff, and Midoriya breathed a heavy sigh of relief. His mentor, on the other hand, was not so easily fooled. His paranoia towards the other adults wasn't dismissed as quickly as his successors, and for good reason. Just like the old spirit expected, another baseless claim shot itself into the sensei. How do we know the kid didn't have anything to do with the break-in? Snipe's perceptive attention locked into the implication that was previously stated. I mean, didn't he just admit that he has a decay quirk? Now it was Aizawa's turn to be fed up with his colleagues. For your information, Midoriya actually helped calm down the chaos from the break-in. I watched the security cameras, and he's accounted for the entire time. I'd appreciate it if you actually think before making such damaging claims about my student. The burst of protectiveness startled the boy, and he turned towards his teacher in shock. He wasn't the only one. Both Gami and Present Mike also snapped their heads to look at the tired pro. Nezu didn't have to look, and simply smiled through the ordeal entirely. Not having 4 different heads, Aizawa chose to turn to look at Midoriya out of all the stares. Yes, problem child, I saw your entire stunt during the break-in. You're starting to make me think that you've got a disorder that only lets you pick the most reckless of plans. The teen looked down bashfully at that, but could feel the tension start to wither from the air. Ignoring the jab at his friend, Gami silently thanked the hero for the extra support. Now that we're done with all this immature finger-pointing, it's best that we hold an emergency staff meeting right now to gather up the rest of the pros, Aizawa announced, quite frankly done with the childish behavior. Ah, I was just about to suggest that, Aizawa-san, Nezu piped in cheerily. It is quite frightening how alike our minds work. The teacher rolled his eyes, but didn't bother to quip back. Midoriya took the opportunity to leave the spotlight of the broken barrier and stand closer to his homeroom teacher. Well, that is the smartest course of action, Cementos agreed, and the rest of the staff followed suit. After all, Nezu was the principal, and no one dared to get on his sadistic side. Wonderful, the rodent exclaimed. I'll meet you all in conference room A, then. Come along now, Midoriya. And that sent the pros right back on the apprehensive path they were just on at harrowing speeds. Wait, you're letting the kids sit in on the meeting, Snipe-sensei shot back. As much as I am for the integration of youth, Midnight started huskily. Is this really a good idea, Nezu? but the principal had already started whisking the boy away from the barrier. "Quite surely. We'll see you all there." Aizawa rushed after the two, muttering curses under his breath concerning the rodent stealing his student. Nezu was moving at a surprising speed, almost as if he was eager to remove himself from the crowd of pros, while Midoriya was simply doing his best to match pace, like a lost puppy. Unbeknownst to him, Gami was floating beside the two, taking occasional glances back at the heroes as well as the rest of the crowd, to make sure they wouldn't try anything. The teen shuffled nervously behind the principal, eyes downcast and hands fumbling. As much as he wanted to sit in on the meeting, he had to agree with Midnight. Was it really a good idea for him to be there, especially since some of the pros knew his secret and some didn't? What if there was a slip-up? It was risky enough for 4 of the staff to know. He couldn't imagine what would happen if the entire staff did. Maybe it was for the best he sat this one out. Nezu, sir, he began under his breath once they were away from prying ears. "I don't have to go if it'll cause problems." "Nonsense," Nezu exclaimed. "It would be most beneficial if you attended." Aizawa narrowed his eyes at that claim, inclining to agree with his student, but he wasn't able to speak as the albino rodent cut him off, seemingly aware that he was about to contradict him. "After all," he continued, "Gami's account of the situation is crucial, since he arrived first at the barrier. And your insight into the damage deserved to be pointed out, for safety reasons." "But can't you just relay that to the rest of the staff yourself?" the boy asked. "And you aren't going to tell them about Gami, are you?" No, the principal laughed. "Keeping your secret under wraps is a priority to me, so I'll keep his account as vague as possible." Nezu lifted a paw to his chin, pretending to contemplate a thought, even though he was currently strolling down the hall. Midoriya figured it was just for dramatic effect, but combined with the added pause he took, it left an eerie silence in the hallway, only accompanied by the echoing of footsteps. "But concerning your attendance at the meeting, I feel it is necessary for you to come. Considering what I just observed outside and what Aizawa has vouched for, your analytics might be very useful." "Vouched?" the student wondered. "What do you mean, vouched?" "I lent him the notebook you let me borrow," Aizawa butted in to clarify. "I figured he'd enjoy flipping through it." Something akin to dwelled anger sparked deep within his soul at that, but he swallowed it back down for his own sake. He was quite protective when it came to his quirk analysis notebooks, and hearing his homeroom teacher had admit to actually handing one of them around so nonchalantly made him feel fury. But this was Nezu they were talking about, and if his notes were safe anywhere, the paws of UA's principal was a decent place to start. "And indeed I did," he assured. "Quite impressive notes for your age, I must say, and that brings me to my next point." Both the ragged pro and the reserved teen turned their attention towards the rodent leading them, waiting on a response to satisfy their curiosity. Nezu smiled thoughtfully. "If someone were to say they had notes of this scale written by a teen your age, most would simply ignore it, as Aizawa-san likely did." Said teacher grumbled and looked away with a scowl. "It is a fatal human flaw to characterize capability by maturity. Many would look away from an achievement like this simply because they believe age defines ability. That is the exact reason I insist you attend this meeting. I refuse to let your intelligence go to waste on the sole prospect of your status as a minor. It is truly illogical." The raven-haired man huffed. "When you put it that way, it makes rational sense, but I'm more concerned about a student sitting in on a meeting about how their school was broken into." "Ah," Nezu sighed and waved a paw. "Well, risks must be taken, sacrifices must be made." Aizawa looked as if he was going to shoot a response back, but it was at that exact moment that the 3 reached the entrance to the conference room. The rodent pushed the doors open, indeed revealing that they were the first ones to arrive. Nezu strolled right on inside, and the other teacher gestured for Midoriya to enter as well. He dared not disobey, and hesitantly took a step forward, wondering where exactly he should sit, if at all. "Is this truly a wise decision?" Gami finally spoke after a long period of absence. "Well," his successor whispered, "it's too late now." There were plenty of extra chairs in Conference Room A, or at least there was what Nezu had said, so Midoriya didn't feel too bad about sitting down and getting comfortable. The principal had chosen his seat for him, so that took away the added stress of potentially taking a seat that didn't belong to him. The teen sat directly between Nezu and Aizawa, with his back facing the door, giving him ample access to get out of the room if necessary. He knew this was an intentional choice, but that didn't mean he understood the reasons behind it. He didn't bother questioning his mentor about the issue. It seemed, quite frankly, pointless. Aizawa was seated next to him, phone in one hand and a stack of papers in the other. He was scrolling through his device while flicking the corners of the stack rhythmically. Just out of the corner of his eye, the boy could tell the papers were long and tedious, most likely office paperwork. He couldn't see what his teacher was scrolling through without turning his head completely, and there was no way he was going to do that. The repetitive flickering of the man's thumb made him want to pull out his own phone, but he was afraid of making such a movement. The door behind him suddenly flew open with a loud bang, and he instinctively flinched hard in his swivel chair, but fought his subconscious to keep still. With each entrance, the flinching grew less and less apparent, until it was almost invisible to even those looking for it. But that didn't erase the automatic fear response that slams triggered in his head, nor did it tone them down. Each bang felt like flooring the gas in an unmoving car, sudden and terrifying. Every time he heard one, his train of thought immediately wanted to remind himself that no one was trying to break down his door and hurt him. That's right. He was safe. So why didn't he feel safe? Wonderful, Nezu cried all of a sudden from his seat to the right. I think that's everyone. The room had largely filled up since he last observed. All the heroes from outside were here in attendance, but the room had a few new additions, mainly being Hound Dog and Lunch Rush. But there was one key component missing from this heroics chaos. We're still missing All Might, 13 remarked from a few seats away. A few collective grumbles could be heard among the table, but that didn't dismiss the fact that the pro was correct. The number one hero was nowhere to be seen. Knowing Yagi, Recovery Girl sighed, he's probably out doing hero work when he should be taking it easy. That made a few heads shake in disappointment, but the matter soon fell into oblivion. At least that was until Snipe picked back up on it again, along with another issue thought to be left at the broken barrier. Wait, we can't be saying anything about All Might, the hero realized. At least not while this kid is around. And so the fear of having all eyes on him became much more than a simple fear. The slightly oversized swivel chair already made Midoriya feel out of place, but now he was debating whether to make a dash for the exit behind him. I'll admit, Nezu began, drawing the attention to him instead, that did slip my mind. Hopefully that isn't too much of a problem for you, Midoriya. What? Snipe cried, following other gasps of surprise at the sadistic rodent's response. It's not, sir, he replied, opting to ignore the rest of the room in favor of the principal seated next to him. But at the same time he couldn't help but wish Nezu kicked him out of the meeting already. That or just the prospect of his existence blissfully ending right there on the spot, whichever came first. But unfortunately for him, neither of those two options presented themselves. Instead, Nezu reached his grubby paws for the third option, the teen was desperately trying to avoid, pulling it into the limelight as if he were discovering a new species of animal. Oh? He pondered. What do you know about All Might, then? That focused all of the attention back onto him, which was the exact opposite of what he wanted. Bringing this topic back up wasn't the only thing starting to resurface, but lying straight to the faces of dozens of pros heroes was not going to cut it, so he swallowed his rising bile and trauma and decided to just get on with it. I can admit, the words began for him thankfully, because if he relied on his shaky confidence they'd be here all day. I didn't know All Might's real name until just now, but I do know about his time limit as well as his other form. The teen debated on whether to add his knowledge of the hero's strange quirk, but none of that had been truly confirmed to him, so it's best to leave that information to himself. And how exactly do you know this sensitive information? Cementost asked carefully as if he were walking on eggshells, and though no one else had said a word, all of the staff were eagerly awaiting a response, especially Aizawa and Nezu, although the former was waiting with more suspicion, while the other with curiosity. He told me, when we met under an overpass about a year ago. The nonchalant answer nearly made every adult in the room deadpan. Aizawa resisted the urge to slam his head into the table in front of him, or better yet, his stack of paperwork. I don't know whether to be relieved or disappointed, the ragged man sighed as his shoulders dropped in displeasure. I'm going to smack that boy the next time I see him, Recovery Girl added. Maybe that'll fix his brain for good this time. Trying to stray away from the comments of utter disbelief on the part of the number one hero, Midnight pointed her flogger-style whip right at Midoriya. You must be a big fan of the big man, huh? She started. Can't say I blame you. I'm not. The simple yet punctuated answer made the R-rated hero, as well as nearly everyone else, do a double-take to process it, all caught off guard by how forceful it came across. The only one not fully surprised was present Mike, but that was only because he got to witness the interaction between the student and the number one hero earlier. And while he couldn't tell why, he could tell that there was at least a hostile relationship between the two, or at least on Midoriya's side. Nezu picked up on the hostility as well, but he chose to save that bit of information for analysis later. The more he learned about the boy sitting next to him, the more interested he became. But now was not the time to pick apart the student like he was an 8th grade biology project. He'd have plenty of time to do that later. Now, the principal reined in his staff. We'll have plenty of time for idle chatter later, but we've got more important issues to discuss at the moment. Hound Dog growled. Lunch Rush and I only know the bare details. You'll need to fill us in. Not a problem, the rodent exclaimed with an inappropriate amount of cheer for the situation. A recap of the situation would be beneficial to us all. Aizawa, would you care to start us off? The pro sighed but picked up his stack of paperwork, lightly tapping the stack against the table. He then laid the stack back down where it was, making Gami shift in confusion at the redundant act. At approximately 12:30 this afternoon, the front entrance barrier activated earlier was incapacitated, allowing a mob of reporters to infiltrate the school grounds. With every word his homeroom teacher took, the severity of the situation was brought back to him, like a slap in the face. The exact method of infiltration was unknown at first, but was later determined to be disintegration. Nezu cut in there. Thanks to Midoriya and Mahima-san's accounts, we can narrow it down to the fact that the field looked like a decay quirk in particular. Wait, Hound Dog interrupted, but with a curious tone of voice. I understand Power Loader, but I don't understand how this kid fits in. The teen was starting to get sick of really being referred to as the kid all the time. Midoriya has a bit of a complex quirk, the principal jumped in to explain before his staff could witch hunt the boy again. But it does allow him to decay objects at touch. That's how he was able to identify the cause of entry so quickly. And before anyone says anything, Aizawa took his turn to interrupt. It has already been confirmed that Midoriya has nothing to do with this break-in. He is accounted for on video surveillance for the entire time the infiltration took place. Hound Dog didn't seem to expect the assertive defense for the boy sitting at the other side of the table, but couldn't argue with any of those claims, not that he particularly wanted to. Besides, he trusted Nezu and Aizawa, so if those two vouched for the student, he had no problem extending his trust to him as well. Anyway, Recovery Girl stated sharply, bringing everyone back to the topic at hand, what is our next course of action, considering we have no current video evidence of who exactly initiated the barrier's destruction? Simple, Aizawa replied without hesitation. I'll get Sukuuchi to run decay and disintegration quirks through our villain database. Those kind of quirks aren't common, so if we get a hit, it's a great place to start. But what if this is a first-time offender? Vlad King pointed out. Or a villain who hasn't been registered in the database yet. Like I said, the underground hero reiterated, it's a great place to start. Considering how little we know about this villain, we need to explore every lead available to us. Are we sure this was the work of a villain, though? Snipe backtracked. I mean, couldn't a reporter have done this for a scoop? Highly unlikely, Nezu chimed in. All reporters must submit their official quirk records to their networking agency when applying for a position. If a reporter truly did this, it would be fairly easy to track the damage back to them, which they would understand as well. Knowing the risk involved when messing with UA, no smart reporter would have jeopardized their career for a story they may or may not get. I can see where you're coming from, Snipe, Aizawa reassured. We do have video evidence of all the reporters crowded by the barrier, so I can have Sukuuchi run all their quirk records easily, but, like Nezu said, it's highly unlikely we'll find our instigator among them. The room devolved into eerie silence after that, each individual pondering something different than the next. All of the previous talk was mere recap from Midoriya, though, so he spent his energy recounting everything he could deduce himself, hoping to find a breakthrough there. The who is mysterious but simple enough. The instigator was an unknown villain, unlikely to have any affiliation with any of the reporters or networking agencies present. The assailant is cunning and opportunistic, using the spontaneous development of the crowd to cover as a way to infiltrate the school without being seen. The what is self-explanatory as well. The front entrance barrier was destroyed with surprising speed, at least according to Gami's account. All 4 layers were completely disintegrated, leading me to believe a decay quirk was the cause. The mob of reporters shielded the assailant from view of the cameras, though, so I can't be completely sure. Where is quite obvious. The break-in occurred at the front entrance of the school, which was being crowded by reporters since early this morning. That fact is easy enough to deduce. The when is clear thanks to Aizawa-sensei's account of the camera feed. The barrier was destroyed at around 12:30 this afternoon. though the villain was likely at the barrier before the initial time, staking out the scene to confirm the risk and the reward of the opportunity. But the most debatable aspect of the whole crime is why. What was the reason behind the attack? Was it to steal something from the school, or an intentional declaration of war? The crime was opportunistic, so it's likely that... Midoriya! Nezu's voice suddenly echoed around his head. Ah! He stumbled out, nearly slamming into the table in shock. The embarrassment quickly set in, so he fumbled around with his words while desperately trying to get his attention off of him. I'm sorry, sir. I was just lost in thought. I could tell. The principal sounded strangely intrigued by that pressing for more. Anything of interest? Nezu was asking him to share his thoughts. His assumptions were that, just assumptions. He was lucky enough to be sitting in on a meeting of this sensitivity. There was really truly no reason for him to contribute as well, but the principal had asked him to question, and he felt obligated to respond as truthfully as possible, whether or not he felt that truth was important. Nezu had been kind enough to keep his secret as well, as allow him to continue to learn here at UA. It was only fair that he did his best to assist in return. That was the formality, after all. I was just trying to piece together the intent behind the break-in, Midoriya muttered just loud enough for everyone to hear. Ah, the rodent huffed. That does bring up a good point. What exactly was the reason behind this crime? The rhetorical question brought only another wave of silence and thought amongst the pros. Sure, Nezu had his own ideas, but he very much wanted to hear the opinions of others before implanting his own into everyone's heads. And by others, he was more interested in one person in particular. How about it, Midoriya? What do you think on the matter? Me? The boy cried out in a mix of bewilderment and shock. The rest of the heroes seemed to agree. What? Nezu, you can't be serious, Vlad King echoed, the thoughts of everyone else in the room. But he just smiled menacingly. Oh, I quite am. Gami, who had been quietly listening in on the meeting since the start, now moved to step in. Just take a deep breath in and collect your thoughts. If you panic here, you will lose any sort of respect you have among these adults. Following his mentor's instructions, he closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, feeling the pressure of his chest expanding. So he listened intently to the sound of the air leaving his nose, focusing on his mind on the hissing noise. He opened his eyes after completing the breath, his panic now just simmering in the background. Well, I'm torn between two reasons, he started carefully, trying not to come off imposing. Either the break-in was to take something from the school's main building, or to be seen as a statement against heroism. That made Nezu smile even wider than before, something the boy didn't think was possible. The response made logical sense, and that was what surprised most of the room. Many of the heroes didn't think the teen would contribute much to the meeting, but his statement was the start to proving otherwise. But what about the attack? 13 added. What was the purpose of the break-in? Was it to ambush a hero? All Might, maybe? Unlikely. That was the moment that Midoriya's brain hit autopilot, no longer concerned about speaking to a group of pro-heroes. If the assailant's true goal was to attack the hero, they would have made their presence known. It was no mistake that the intruder was not caught on camera. That was intentional. The fact that no one saw the intruder further confirms to me that this was an infiltration, not an ambush. Plus, there's no staff members or students currently unaccounted for. President Mike began to see the teen's point. And no injuries that were linked to an attack were reported. If the villain's plan was to attack someone but failed, we would have likely caught them. I don't think the intruder's intent was to ambush anyone, neither hero nor student. I agree with that wholeheartedly, Nezu confirmed. Using that exact thought process, I was able to rule out the idea of a planned or spontaneous ambush. Ah, Midoriya interjected right after hearing that. That reminds me of something I was thinking about before. The boy raised a hand to his chin, pressing a pointer finger to his cheek, to further separate his thoughts before speaking. He could feel shivers run down his spine, along with the rising feeling of dread, but he pushed them back down. He still had more to say. He still had to be useful. The crowd of reporters obviously wasn't planned at all. It was a spontaneous development, which makes planning around it a challenge. The fact increases the likelihood of this being a statement attack rather than an infiltration to take something, though that doesn't take the idea of intruder stealing something off of the table. So you're saying due to the nature of the situation, Aizawa clarified. It would be easier to pull off a scare tactic than a planned infiltration with a set goal. The teen nodded, but his hand twitched violently, almost breaking his confidence. Exactly. Though if the assailant had pre-planned what they would do upon breaking into the school, it's possible their motive was to steal something. They could have just used the opportunity the mob created to jumpstart their plan. Interesting, Nezu hummed. "Reviewing all of our footage seems like it must, then. I'll need all the files to be checked and accounted for. If this villain did manage to take something from under our noses, we need to figure out exactly what it is that's missing, no matter the sensitivity." Midoriya opened his mouth to say more, but finally found that his train of thought was empty. In fact, it was more derailing than anything else. His anxiety and paranoia had finally caught up to him. After all, he couldn't run on autopilot forever, as much as he wanted to. He desperately hoped that this would conclude the meeting, because he had nothing left. That was all of his analysis that he had time to complete. And now that it was all out, he had no more information, no more use. What if someone had another question? Would Nezu be upset with him? Would the rest of the heroes in the room retake their minimal respect for him? Hearing his breathing start to worsen, he tried to calm himself down, to no avail. He couldn't break down here. That would screw up everything. Everyone would get upset with him. Everyone would be disappointed in him. He had to hold it in. He pushed against the hurricane forming in his stomach, hopelessly trying to fight it from surfacing. Gami was good at picking up his successor's moods, albeit not as good as he wanted to be, but decent enough. So when his gaze picked up on the slightest twitches coming from the boy's fingers, he knew something was terribly wrong. "Just ask to leave. I'm sure they'll allow you to." I can't. The teen's head shook subtly, so slightly that one would miss it if they weren't looking. His eyelids fluttered as his breaths turned from quiet and pained to raspy and uneven. It was something he found himself resorting to during these episodes, quiet hyperventilating. His fingers now curled, looking for something to clutch around, but he wouldn't dare to bring them to his shirt and risk someone noticing his current panic. He wanted to clasp his hands together and pick at the fibers of his gloves like he always did, but his blood felt like ice, freezing all possible movement. So he did the next best thing and clutched onto his pants for dear life. Present Mike had exceptional hearing, though not for the reason you'd expect. His quirk did not give him super hearing. It actually had the opposite effect. Years of listening to the damaging volumes of his own screams left the hero suffering from hearing loss in both ears. Such a detriment could develop into an occupational hazard, so he quickly invested in hearing aids. They were small and unnoticeable unless one was searching for them, and he often had cranked them up a few settings so he could eavesdrop on the staff and students. Was it wrong and invasive? Maybe. But did the pro enjoy some good gossip? And there was only so much he could get from Kayama. So when quiet gasps and wheezes reached his ears from 2 seats over, needless to say, he was quite concerned. The sad part about it was he knew exactly who they were originating from. It nearly made him sick to think that his mind registered those noises as familiar now. But the blonde couldn't lie to himself or attempt to trick his brain. He just kept telling the guilt to go away as he looked over to Midoriya in worry. The hero was surprised that Aizawa, who was next to the teen, didn't seem to hear a thing. How high were his hearing aids turned up? How hushed were those noises? When Nezu made eye contact with him, he felt slightly relieved in the sense that he wasn't going crazy or hearing things. The principal seemed to acknowledge the situation currently playing out, and gave a small nod as reassurance. He watched the mammal turn his attention back towards the faintly shaking boy, all while the rest of the room didn't even notice, too wrapped up in their conversations to care. Still, Yamada moved to step out of his chair and approach the student, but to his implied actions, true to them, Nezu beat him to the punch. "Well," he began, the conversations around him stopping to give them his attention. "I trust you all will investigate into the matters revealed at this meeting. You are all free to remain here and continue discussing the incident. However, I will be taking a break with Midoriya." "What?" came from around the room in a chorus of shared confusion. Even Aizawa, who was squished between the green-haired boy and his husband, wasn't sure if he completely registered what was being said. "I won't repeat myself." Nezu's words cut through the room like a scorching knife, sharp and unyielding. "Come, Midoriya, let's get going." Nearly all the teachers cried out in surprise when the student sitting with them stood up robotically, without a moment of hesitation, as if he were on a charted course. Midoriya turned slowly and followed the principal out of the conference room, all without saying a word in response. Aizawa, who had seen a lot of eerie shit while out on patrol or engaging in nighttime fights, still seemed relatively spooked by the display, though he would never admit it if even asked. But no one dared argue against the rodent or cried out for the boy to stay. As for Midoriya, his foggy head was just happy to finally receive something he could process without a failure. A command. Nothing truly registered through Midoriya's eyes. It was all just a mess of shapes and colors, all smashed together like they were trapped in a blender. His soft footsteps didn't even make it from his ears to his brain. The echoing of thumping heartbeat bounced around in his skull. It was kind of funny, in an oddly depressing way, that he was back on autopilot again. His warped sense of comfort felt most at home when he wasn't thinking, and that's exactly what autopilot was for him, not thinking. He just let his instincts take over him and lead him wherever. But just because he felt more comfortable like this didn't mean that he enjoyed acting this way. It was a choice between comfort and freedom, and sometimes he found himself hating both options. So he didn't realize he was currently sitting on the couch in Nezu's office until the principal asked him something. Of course, the comment never actually made it through his thought process, so the boy cocked his head slightly, hoping that would be enough for Nezu to repeat himself. "I was wondering if you would care for some tea." The mammal smiled while standing by a small table against the wall. His mind was still hazy, and he didn't trust the words to come clearly out of his mouth, so the teen just nodded. As more seconds passed, his consciousness grew less muddy, and he took time to properly observe his surroundings. The student was curled into the armrest of the couch, though in a more formal way than he was expecting. Both of his feet were still planted firmly on the floor, with his legs pressed together. His upper body was squished tightly into the side of the couch, almost as if he was trying to take up as little room as possible. His balled-up hands clutched desperately at his lap, wringing out his pants like a towel. He could feel slight tremors run down his spine and to the tips of his fingers. Nezu walked over to the coffee table by the couch, 2 glasses in paw. He placed both cups on said table, pushing one closer to where Midoriya sat. He watched the wispy steam swirl into the air, not making a move to grab his drink. "I hope you enjoy it," the principal attempted at light-hearted conversation. "Chamomile tea is known to reduce stress and induce the feeling of relaxation." Again, not trusting his speech, the boy just nodded. It took him a few moments to work up the courage to grab his cup, but the minute its warmth touched his gloved hand, he felt at peace. He now gripped the glass with both hands, wishing to feel more of that warmth in his soul. He didn't take a sip, but merely sat unmoving with the cup clutched between his fingers. By that point, Nezu had pulled up an extra chair to the other side of the coffee table, preferring to give Midoriya the entirety of the couch. He watched the teen's still form with interest. The rodent wasn't lost by any means, his quirk giving him understanding of even the most confusing of human psyche. But he had only read about the minds as severely damaged as Midoriya's in psychology books, never having the experience of seeing it in person. The rational portion of his brain and mind wanted desperately to pick apart at the boy, to figure out what made him tick. But at the same time, there was a sliver of his morality that felt almost sad as he was witnessing the display in front of him. It had been a while since he felt sympathetic towards a human, and the idea of meeting someone as potentially damaged as himself thrilled the principal more than picking him apart. Maybe he'd entertain his subconscious this one time. Nezu stood up and walked over near the small table where he'd prepared the tea. His back to the student, he knelt down at one of the bookcases and reached his paws towards a wooden box on the bottom shelf. He pulled it out gently, careful not to scrape it against the floor. It wasn't particularly heavy, but for someone with Nezu's stature, lifting it could prove difficult. But he managed to haul it to the coffee table and placed it down softly. In the corner of his eye, he noticed the teen eyeing the object with a curious glint, only making the rodent smirk wider. "Would you care for a game of chess, Midoriya?" he asked with a hint of unnatural cheer. "I would truly like to get to know you." Chess? At a time like this? He couldn't lie, the idea sounded quite entertaining, but what about the meeting and all the other heroes? Nezu seemed to catch on to his hesitation. "I'm sure the other heroes will be fine wrapping the meeting up without us." His gut wasn't sure of the principal's words, but at the feeling of the sudden touch of his mentor's hand to his shoulder, he eased up. It was easy to forget that the ghost was in the same room as him sometimes, especially during and after breakdowns like this. "That sounds nice," were the first words that exited his mouth upon leaving the conference room. "Oh, wonderful," he smiled. "I'll set up the board then." He watched the mammal open the box, pulling out a beautiful wooden chessboard and a sack presumably filled with the pieces. The box container reminded him of Ishihara's back in the guest room, but this one just didn't feel quite the same. Ignoring the slight sensation of sadness, his eyes continued to follow the erratic yet graceful movements of Nezu's paws while setting up the pieces. The principal had set aside all of the dark pieces for himself, and had given Midoriya the lighter ones. Honestly, he was fine either way. Ishihara had taught him the best ways to start with either color, but he did prefer the dark pieces. Something about playing an underdog gave him a spark of satisfaction that made enjoying the game all the easier. The board was eventually all set up, so the teen removed one of his hands from the cup to make his first move, but before he could, Nezu piped up again. "Before we get started," he chuckled, "how about we spice up the game a bit?" The boy's brows furrowed. "What do you mean by that?" The rodent in front of him let out another stifled giggle, the sound unnerving him. "Every time you capture an opponent's piece, you get to ask them a question. No lying or evading allowed." "I do not like the sound of this," Gami whispered. Midoriya couldn't agree more. Nezu easily picked up the apprehensiveness. "The rules apply to me as well. This is your opportunity to ask me anything." That made the idea sound a bit more appealing. Knowing more about the principal would be beneficial in the long run, but who knew what the sadistic animal in front of him would ask? The thought made him shudder. The situation was another example of his old age debate between comfort and freedom. He could stay in his secluded comfort zone and deny participating while he still could, or give his urge for freedom and risk having to answer emotionally volatile questions. Both had their pros and cons, and this wasn't the first time he felt equally torn. So he reached into his pant pocket, pulled out a single yen coin. It was still shiny, practically fresh off the mint. He twirled the coin between his fingers, watching the glint of reflection light move across the surface. "Heads or tails?" he asked without making proper eye contact with anyone, though Nezu was smart enough to understand the boy was talking to the ghost that he claimed followed him around all day. "Heads." His successor had taken him to choose between the two often, enough that he understood what it meant. "Heads it is," he repeated for no one particular. Leaning over the armrest of the couch, he flicked the coin from his fingers, watching it clatter against the floor as it spun around. The scratchy metallic noise made as it revolved became almost pleasing to listen to, but it eventually stopped as the coin settled to his side. Leaning over further to pick the coin up, he got a good view of the side it had landed on. "All right, then," the teen stated, with neither excitement nor disappointment. "Let's get started." Nezu flashed his wide signature smirk. "Oh, wonderful. Your move, then." And so Midoriya did as he was told, placing the coin on the table exactly how he picked it up from the floor, careful not to make too much noise. He didn't hesitate with his first move, grabbing one of his pawns near the center of the row and moving it up 2 spaces. The principal's smirk didn't fade as he slid one of his own darker pawns to match the move exactly. So that was how Nezu was going to play, then. That was fine. He had no problem playing aggressively, even if it guaranteed Nezu the first question. The boy moved the next pawn up 2 spaces, so it was side by side with the first one he moved. The rodent didn't even begin to bother hiding his increasingly large smile as he moved his pawn from before, capturing the pawn Midoriya just moved. The giddy look on his face remained as he picked up the light-colored piece and brought it off the board. "Well then, Midoriya," he seemed to have his question thought out already. "Who is your favorite hero?" The question was innocent enough and relatively easy to answer. "Eraserhead." The answer made the principal hum, as if he was trying to dig deeper into the response. But the teen didn't let him as he aggressively moved his bishop into play. Nezu held a chuckle and returned with equally forced move of his own, queen, bringing the student into check. Unfazed, he moved his light king piece out of the way and watched the principal move a pawn directly into the line of his now active bishop. The boy narrowed his eyes at the suicidal act, but he took the piece anyway. "Oh, wonderful." Nezu seemed way too enthusiastic for this. "What is your question?" He didn't respond right away, not having thought about what to ask. He needed something simple, yet respectful. After all, this was still the principal of UA he was conversing with. "Can you explain your quirk?" Midoriya asked carefully. "My quirk?" he repeated, not expecting that as a question. "Well, my quirk is called High Spec. It's a mutant quirk that has exponentially increased my intelligence to that, well, beyond human capacity. My quirk is what has allowed me to integrate into human life so painlessly." He nodded at the reply, soaking as much of the key information as possible for record later. He didn't want to pull out his notebook now in the middle of the game. That would be quite rude, after all. The two continued with their game, making aggressive yet calculated plays. After about 10 more turns, most of the pieces were scattered around the chessboard, but it didn't take long for another piece to get captured, this time being one of Midoriya's white bishops. Nezu laughed as he used his pawn to knock the bishop off the board. "It's my turn again. How wonderful. Tell me about your school life before coming to UA." The typically shy boy narrowed his eyes apprehensively. "That's not a question." "Oh, of course, my bad, he corrected himself. "What was school like before coming to UA?" Gami, who had been watching the events of the game since it had started, growled at the sensitive question, but Midoriya just waved him off. The exchange was not missed by the observant mammal, however. Collecting his thoughts delicately, he answered with more hesitation than the last time. Mundane. And lonely. There was a long pause after that, and upon realizing that the boy would not say any more concerning the topic, Nezu didn't push. They resumed playing the game. This time, though, the principal noted some increased aggressiveness in his opponent's plays, forcing his queen to retreat with a few pawns. A bit distracted, Nezu didn't notice a trap being set until a few moves in, but by that point there wasn't much he could do. Both his knight and pawn were in danger, and he could only move one. So he chose the optimal piece and allowed his pawn to be captured. This time, the teen had a question ready. "What's your favorite brew of tea?" He instinctively made the rodent take a sip of his chamomile. "That would have to be green tea. A bit of a basic choice, but it does help and lessen the symptoms of my PTSD." The surprise on Midoriya's face was visible. Not obvious, but still visible. The spirit standing next to him was reasonably surprised at the reply as well, but neither pushed for more. The response was sensitive enough. The student kept on the offensive, constantly making Nezu monitor the position of his queen. Pushing his light knight forward, he once again put the principal's queen in danger, but instead of retreating this time, Nezu moved the piece far onto Midoriya's side of the board, taking a pawn in the process. He wasted no time with his next question. "What is Gami-san to you?" That made the boy blink. He really wasn't expecting a question like that, but it still made him pause. Of course he knew exactly what his relationship with the old ghost was, but it was a bit difficult to explain. "Gami is a lot of things. The easiest way to describe our relationship would be a mentor and a successor, I guess. But it's a lot more complicated than that." He paused to look up at the specter next to him, but couldn't detect any hint of emotion. "Gami has filled a lot of roles for me, from a mentor to a parental figure to a friend. I'm just really grateful he decided to stick around with me." Midoriya swore he heard a sniffle come from the space next to him, but he didn't bring it up to spare the ghost his embarrassment. A complex relationship indeed," Nezu agreed. "Let's continue." And so they did. It was only 2 more moves later that Nezu captured a white rook. "Why aren't you a fan of All Might?" Gami felt the temperature in the room drop a few degrees. The pleasant atmosphere created by the last question completely was erased. Looking over to the seated boy, he noticed the grip on his pants now much tighter than before, as if he was restraining himself. Twisting his body, the spirit moved to ruffle his hair, but stopped when he saw his shoulders tense up, deciding against it. He didn't even know where to start when it came to All Might. The man had been his idol for almost his entire life, and that day they met ruined everything. For a hero who preached such inspiring ideals, he sure didn't follow them. That experience constantly made him wonder whether it would have been better for him to live his life in ignorant bliss. The words came out laced with more anger than Midoriya would have liked, but he had thankfully restrained most of his outburst. "He's a hypocrite, with flawed logic." Catching his tongue, he refused to say any more. Nezu looked a bit surprised at the answer, but not necessarily offended or anything. "Such strong words. Very interesting indeed," he remarked, as if he was studying the boy in front of him. "I wonder what brought you to that conclusion." He couldn't quite catch himself this time. "You already used up your question." "That is true," the mammal chuckled dryly. "Well, your turn then." Midoriya, still clouded with bits of remaining anger, mistakenly moved a simple pawn, allowing the principal to capture his last rook with his queen, as well as to put his king back into check. He nearly slammed his fist against the table, but he had more restraint than that, and merely clutched his pants tighter. Nezu wasn't an idiot. In fact, he was quite the opposite. He could see the obvious emotional strain his last question brought, and as much as he wanted to know the story behind the boy's dislike of the #1 hero, inquiring deeper into the matter could shut him down for good, so he switched gears a bit. "What are you most scared of?" he asked as he moved the rook off the board. Scared of? That was a change of topic, still a sensitive one, though. There were a lot of things he was scared of, not that he would ever admit to that, but what scared him the most? Well, that was something he wasn't sure he could decide. I don't know," the teen admitted. Not quite the response Nezu was expecting, he rephrased the question. "What's something you're scared of, then?" Still not a question he wanted to answer, but naming one fear was better than listing them all. "I don't like fire. Heat is fine, though." "Fair enough. the rodent hummed. The answer made sense, considering what he knew about the boy. Midoriya moved his king out of check, and the game continued. The two players exchanged moves, sliding their knights around the board as if it was a real track for horses. Seeing a fateful opportunity, the analytical student used Nezu's move against him, moving his knight to capture a dark pawn and put his king in check at the same time. Keeping up the round of reverse, he shot the principal's question right back at him. What scares you the most? Unlike he himself did, Nezu paused for a moment to think before answering snappily. I guess my greatest fear would be feeling helpless again. There was a lot to unpack in that statement. Helpless? Again? It made the boy's mind spin as he tried to piece together what the rodent in front of him meant by that, but he didn't bother asking another follow-up, just nodding and focusing attention back on the game. The principal moved his king out of check, and it was at that moment that Midoriya could see his winning play. Nezu had practically trapped his own king at this point. All he needed was to eliminate the Black Knight near it, and he was sure his plan would work. He had a risky idea to capture that piece, but pushed his self-doubt down just enough to go through with it. The teen slid his queen right next to Nezu's side of the board, allowing it into a position where it was putting the opposing king in check, but also at risk of being captured by the knight. Now he could only hope that the principal took the bait. The next second felt like an eternity, but alas, Nezu moved his knight to capture the queen, falling right into Midoriya's trap. Still, their game of questions and answers didn't cease. I know you've explained how you interact with souls before, so hopefully I'm still understanding this right. But have you ever had to send the soul of a loved one off? Yes. There was no hesitation behind that response. Instead, only hard punctuality. Nezu took it as a cue that this was an extremely sensitive topic and left it at that. All right, then. Your move, he reminded. Without even a smile on his face, the boy moved his bishop instantly into the pre-planned spot. Checkmate. The mammal carefully reviewed his king's movement options, but true to the words spoken, there was nowhere he could go. Sighing heavily, he placed both paws on the table. Congratulations, he cheered, his mood shifting drastically. That was a most exciting game. Gami, who was still observing, celebrated as well. That was truly beautifully executed. Well done. His heart warmed at the praise from both sides, but he still felt generally down from that last question. I guess I was simply too focused on taking pieces to ask questions, the principal tried to explain, distracted by the wrong motive. Midoriya's eyes narrowed, wondering if the intellectual in front of him simply just let him win. But he didn't have too much time to ponder that option, as a soft knock came from the door behind him. Come in, Nezu called, not bothering to even look up. The teen turned around, though, curious to see who was entering. His mentor followed suit. Yamada walked in slowly, unsure of what to expect, but seeing Nezu and Midoriya seated with a chessboard was certainly not a possibility he had thought of. He didn't bother closing the door behind him, leaving it slightly ajar. Hey, little listener, I came to see if you were ready to leave. The meeting's over, he couldn't help but ask. Yeah, the pro confirmed. It ended a little while ago. Nodding, the boy set his empty cup of coffee on the coffee table, to which Nezu grabbed and picked it up along with his own cup. It was a pleasure playing against you, Midoriya. I hope we can do so again in the future. Yeah, he responded, a bit unsure of himself. Thank you for the tea, sir. The principal laughed. It was no trouble at all, and please, call me Nezu. That would not happen for a long time, but the student nodded anyway. He picked himself up off the couch and was smoothing out the wrinkles that was a mess on his uniform pants. Swinging his backpack over his shoulder, he prepared to exit the room with Present Mike. Do not forget about your coin, Gami reminded him. Huffing lightly, he turned back around to pick up the piece of currency. Lifting it to his fingers, he watched the sunlight bounce off its surface. It was still facing the exact side it had landed on when he flicked it earlier, making him half-heartedly stuff it into his pocket before leaving. Midori wished the tail side looked more appealing. Despite the engaging game of chess, Midori still didn't feel that much better. He was still feeling the effects of his panic attack, far after it was over. Of course, he didn't really point it out to Aizawa or Yamada. The day had come and gone fairly quickly, despite how eventful it turned out to be. The three had taken out food for dinner, of course, courtesy of the ragged underground hero, and immediately retreated back to their designated corners of the house. The two teachers lounged together in the living room, while the teen remained isolated in the guest room. Well, isolated would be a lie. Lynx was there as well, but the two respected each other's personal space by staying in opposite corners. The boy was curled up on the bed, while the small kitten was huddled underneath the desk. Midoriya couldn't deny he was a bit bored, along with feeling stressed. He couldn't really write notes while on the bed, and the feline was preventing him from sitting at the desk. He had resorted to staring at the shelves of greenery to pass the time, but it had almost been 30 minutes after dinner, and his attention was running thin. "Why don't you do something productive?" Gami suggested. The teen groaned. "But there's nothing productive to do." The ghost sighed at his successor's childish antics. He really wished the boy wouldn't isolate himself like he did, and worked harder to develop bonds with the adults that he was staying with, but the man wasn't going to force anything after all. He knew these things took time. He was happy enough that he was eating with them, so that was a good start. Then, both heard a buzzing sound come from the backpack at the foot of the bed. Curious, Midoriya leaned over to the side to pull the bag up and unzipped it hastily. He pulled out his phone unsurprised. What else would have been vibrating in his school bag? Turning on his cell, he noticed one pop-up on the screen. Assuming it was a news update, he just ignored it, placing his phone in the corner of the bed and laid back down. His fluffy green hair plopped over his eyes, so he used his breath to push it out of the way. He tried closing his eyes to calm himself, but that only made him focus on his thumping heartbeat even more, so he opened them back up. There was another buzz from his phone. "You should probably check that." He groaned again. "Fine." Locking his dreary form upright again, he reached for his phone. Now there were 2 pop-ups on the screen, but when he actually took the time to read them, he realized they weren't news updates at all. "Shoto sent me a text." It came out more of a confused response than a statement. That made the spirit perk up real quick. "Oh?" "Don't even start," Midoriya attempted. "It is far too late for that," Gami stated bluntly. "What did he say?" "Hold on, I'm checking right now." The boy quickly unlocked his device and opened up his messages. Clicking on the candy cane student's contact, he was able to see the 2 new texts on his phone. "Hey, how are you doing?" He was about to read them to his mentor, but upon seeing the ghost eyeing his screen from over his shoulder, he scoffed lightly. The man didn't seem to care. "He texted you first." "And?" he replied sarcastically. "Stop making weird implications." "Do you plan on answering him back?" "Obviously, I'm not just going to ignore him." He rolled his eyes dramatically, making sure the specter noticed. Fumbling with his gloved fingers, he typed out a series of rushed responses. "Hey, I'm doing all right. What about you?" It didn't take long for a reply to come in. Todoroki must have been waiting by his phone. "I'm a bit tired, though I've attributed that to the chaos that happened earlier." "Chaos? Did he mean the panic during the security breach or something at home?" Midoriya moved to clarify. "You're talking about the panic at school, right?" Once again the response came in quick. "Yes. I hope you were not injured during the incident." When he received that second text, the boy knew the spirit next to him was going to make another remark, so he quickly turned around to face him and cut him off before he even began. "He's just being a concerned friend," he interjected the man's drawn-in breath. "I did not say anything," Gami finished snidely. The smirk on his face was nearly auditory. He huffed like the bothered teenager he was, but gave up and grabbed his phone instead. The ghost took that as a victory and smirked even wider, though no one could see it. "I've got nothing more than a few aches. I hope you didn't get hurt either." "Concerned friend?" "Yes," he hissed. "I'm returning the formality." He was unable to ignore the light chuckling coming from behind him, but he did his best. "I was not injured, though that was due to your efforts with Ida and Uraraka." The teen felt his face heat up slightly, but he just credited the feeling to embarrassment. Thankfully, Gami didn't say anything. "Ah, well, the 3 of us couldn't just stand around and do nothing. Ida did most of the work, though." "Izu," the spirit attempted to sing-song, but ended up sounding more like a disappointed parent than anything. "We have talked about this." Confused, he looked back at the man. "What?" "About giving yourself more credit." Midoriya shrugged. "It's true. Ida was the one to calm everyone down." Gami tried to refute, but then another buzz came in. "It was your plan, though." That confused the boy even more. How did Todoroki know that? "How did you know?" "See, even he agrees that you need to give yourself more credit." Gami tried to emphasize his point further. "I took a guess. I figured a plan as reckless as that would only be yours." The ghost let out a hard laugh, something he didn't do often. "I'm starting to like this child more and more." The shocked student merely just sat there. "I don't know whether I should take that as a compliment or an insult." "I guess that's fair," he sent back to Todoroki. Midoriya's confidence was a swirling mess at this point, unsure of whether to skyrocket or to go right down the drain. But as the next text arrived, it didn't take long for him to decide. Still, your plan was quite effective, so I shouldn't complain. Though that does make me wonder why you gave up your position as president to Ida. The praise made him feel good about himself, but concerning the matter of class president spot, he thought it was quite obvious. Gami didn't say a word, slightly wondering how his successor was going to go about it. The boy's fingers hovered over the screen for quite a while as he debated with himself on how to word his response, without sounding rude. After a few more moments, he hashed out a message of a few words, afraid to lose Todoroki's attention. I just don't think I was right for the job. Ida's really good at leading others, so I felt if anyone should be president, it should be him. The red and white-haired boy's response was considerably slower than before, making Midoriya wonder if he had said something wrong. His anxiety from before just started to build, now being fueled by a new insecurity. That's understandable. I'm glad that you're still on the council as secretary, though. Another odd rush of a familiar pride. It swelled within him. Reading his friend's words, the nervousness from before was just all gone. Maybe being on the council wouldn't be so bad after all. Thanks. I honestly only stayed on the council to honor Ida's request, but you saying that makes me feel better about it. The teen swiftly turned around at the snort that came from behind him. His eyes were met with the sight of the old ghost holding a bony hand to where his mouth probably was and shaking a bit. What's up with you? He questioned skeptically. Oh, nothing. Nothing at all, Gami answered with a hint of sarcasm that made the boy wonder if he was being serious. I'm glad, was the response back from Todoroki. All it took was that single sentence, those 2 words, for a bright smile to explode on Midoriya's face. Suddenly all the events that happened throughout the day were forgotten, replaced by a giddy feeling of bubbliness. The spirit simply watched from the spot on by the bed. As much as he enjoyed teasing his successor, he wouldn't dare ruin the rare mood he was in. It had been a while since the man had seen him so happy. Another buzz came in on his phone, making the attention of both return to the screen. Sorry, I have to go. My father's calling me. The drop in his shoulders was near instant, and though he was a bit saddened at the fact that Todoroki had to go, he was more than grateful at the chance to talk to him in the first place. Something about chatting with a normally stoic boy was so enjoyable. He couldn't really put it into words. That's fine. It was nice talking to you. Stay safe. Midoriya held his phone in his hand and he watched as those messages were sent. He watched as the delivered notification popped up on the screen, making his phone hum. He held onto the device a little longer, but after a few minutes, he set it back down at the edge of the bed nervously. The red notification never popped up. After Todoroki left, Midoriya had to find new ways to occupy his time. He bounced around activities, from scrolling through news updates on his phone to tending to his plants, to even playing 20 questions with Gami. If anyone popped their head into the room, they'd easily be able to tell how bored he was, though he would never complain about it. His bedroom is all. Eventually, night creeped in and the sun kissed the horizon goodbye. The teen still hadn't interacted with anyone in the household since dinner, and he was intent on staying that way. His mentor, on the other hand, was growing tired of the stuffy room. Why don't you take a break from this room? He tried to suggest without implying that he was the one to desperately want to leave. Why, I'm perfectly fine like this, the boy questioned while narrowing his eyes. This was going to be harder than he thought, but the ghost knew it would be beneficial for both of them to leave the room for a bit. I just presumed you would want to be in a more comfortable spot for when you sort this evening. The appeal to his successor's sense of work seemed to be enough to persuade him. I guess, but not now. I'll go later when they're both asleep. That was a fair compromise, so the man didn't argue it more. It was already pretty late, so just past midnight, the 2 heroes were bound to hit the hay soon. Of course, he would love it if Midoriya went to sleep earlier and got more rest, but he of all people understood that a proper sleep schedule was nearly impossible when constantly plagued with declining timers. A desk life was currently, and always, a stressful one, especially if social relations were a priority. The 2 were cut out of their respective thoughts at the sound of footprints coming down the hallway. Afraid of being caught awake, he dived under the covers, a stunt that children typically performed. The sound stopped right in front of the guest room door, and the teen slowed his breathing to further add to the authenticity of it. Should we go in and say good night? He recognized the hushed whisper of the voice of Present Mike. No, he's probably asleep. The harsh tone could only be Aizawa. Plus, he's not 5. The sound of Yamada's groan could be heard, but the 2 walked away from the door at that, presumably towards their own room instead. Letting out his own sigh of relief, he crawled out from under the blankets and tiptoed his way to the door. with Gami floating behind. Pressing his ear against the door, the boy listened as the other door was opened and then closed, and after a while of silence, the duo seemed it was safe to leave. Silencing his footsteps was a trick that Midori had learned a long time ago, but still one of his most useful ones. There was practically no sound as his bare socks touched the hardwood. He shifted his body weight periodically, still unsure of where the creaky floorboards were. All of the lights in the house were turned off, leaving him guided by only moonlight. Carefully he made his way to the living room and sat down softly on the couch. Surprisingly, the dark atmosphere felt oddly comforting, and he didn't want to disturb it by starting his work. But the clock was ticking, and the night wasn't getting any younger, so he sucked it up and did it anyway. It was almost surreal when all of the souls popped into the living room. Most of them still had a bright glow to them, and lit up the room as if it was an observatory. The teen had always viewed the little puffs of light as stars, but being in the dark room really made it seem that way. He sat still for a moment, just taking in the scene around him, before immediately feeling a rush of guilt. These were all real people that had died. He shouldn't be enjoying this, not in the slightest. Naturally, the dim souls crowded around him, so he reached for one of those, cupping it gently in his hands. It wasn't as warm as the others, almost as if he was holding a breath of autumn air. He swiftly got to work, letting his mind shut down and run on autopilot. "Hey, Gami," he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "How did you do this for 5 centuries?" The ghost didn't seem to understand. "What do you mean?" "Well, this job is really depressing," he stated bluntly. "And I know you had to do it for a full century, but why did you continue for 4 more? That caught the spirit off guard, at least, according to his body language. But he didn't answer right away, leaving the question to dwell in the air like a musty smell. "I do not remember," the man answered with what seemed to be a hint of anguish. "Every time I attempt to, all I get is a rush of blankness and a slight migraine." "Oh. Well, that was to be expected. His mentor didn't remember much about his past life, only bits and pieces that the two were desperately trying to fit together like lost puzzle pieces. "However," he perked up at that, "whenever I try to remember my time as Death, I feel a mix of strange emotions, almost like anguished determination, if I were to describe it." Anguished determination? What was that even supposed to mean? What kind of situation would provoke one to feel that way? "You mean desperation?" the boy tried to rationalize. "No, not desperation," the spectre replied, picky. "It feels like determination, but not the inspirational kind." That just confused him even further. Wasn't determination supposed to be inspiring? He recorded the strange account in the back of his mind for further analysis later, but otherwise he dropped the subject. The two continued their idle chatter for a few more minutes, casually switching conversation topics. A sudden creak came from the hallway, and both of them froze. Midori quickly stopped sorting, which put out all the light from the room for the souls, and he held his breath. A few more creaks were heard, confirming that this was in fact real and not a trick of his brain. He pulled his legs onto the couch quietly, shrinking his form to better hide himself in the darkness. He wasn't sure if his breathing was quiet enough, so he brought a hand to his mouth just in case. As the steps came closer, he could hear a hushed voice hiss at something. Straining his ears, he could make out the voice of his homeroom teacher talking quietly to himself. "Seriously, Nezu, if discussing Bakugo was the only reason you called me, you could have left it for tomorrow in person." That pretty much confirmed that Aizawa was on the phone with Nezu, not talking to himself. There was a short pause, as Midoriya couldn't make out what the principal was saying on the other end, but he stayed quiet. He felt a bit guilty for eavesdropping, but it wasn't his intention, and if he came out now, Aizawa would just get upset with him being up still. "Well, I wanted to move him to general studies, but you wouldn't let me." The pro seemed to be getting upset. "And you still haven't explained why." "What?" Aizawa had wanted to move Bakugo out of the hero course as a result of the incident during the training exercise. He understood the reasoning behind a decision like that, but the fact that Nezu denied him, that was even stranger of an issue that was never brought up. "I'm telling you, it doesn't seem like a simple anger management issue." The frustration was now obvious. "Bakugo has a lot of unnatural hostility towards Midoriya, almost like a grudge. I've seen some hostility towards Todoroki, but compared to the problem child, it's nothing, and the rest of the class has gotten off easy considering the boy's temper." Midoriya gulped. Of course, an observant hero like Eraserhead had noticed the odd relationship between himself and the other. He was hoping no one would pick up on that. Nezu had figured it out easily, after all, with only a few references to go off of. The last thing he wanted for his past to catch back up to him. He was here at UA. for a fresh start. Well, as fresh a start as he could get. I agree, the kid's got potential, considering we push him in the right direction, but that doesn't dismiss his actions against the other students involved. Whether you want to admit it or not, we got lucky he hit Midoriya, and not one of the other two. He could hear an exasperated sigh come from Aizawa. It was echoing loud and clear in the silent evening. I just don't understand why you insist on not expelling him, he hissed out. We've never tolerated this kind of behavior before. Aizawa wanted Bakugo expelled? Wow, he knew his teacher wanted to punish him, but he had no idea he wanted that drastic of a reprimand. It makes sense. He could acknowledge that, but still, he couldn't help but think of what the decision might have been if he hadn't voiced his opinion to Nezu, if that was even the deciding factor in the first place. Relief had never punched him quite so hard before. Yeah, I switched around the seats. Midoriya's in the back with Todoroki and Yaoyorozu's up with Bakugo. It's the best option for all three parties, Bakugo, Midoriya, and the other two, Ida and Uraraka. So that was the reason behind the seat swap today. Well, with the context, it now made sense. Plus, he'd be lying if he didn't admit that he was more than pleased with his new seat. He really enjoyed hanging around Todoroki, even though they'd only talked a few times. If this is all you wanted to talk about, then I'm hanging up. It's 1 in the fucking morning, Nezu. I know you're a night owl, but some of us like to get our beauty sleep when we can. That nearly made the boy snort in amusement, but he managed to hold it in. He had never heard Aizawa talk like that before, and the change in personality was enough to incite some laughter. Sure, whatever. Good night. An audible click could be heard after that, signaling the end of the phone call, and with that click came the rush of fear that reminded him of his current situation. He was hiding in the living room, and his homeroom teacher was standing just beyond the hallway. He desperately hoped that the man would return back to his room and not decide to walk a few steps in further. The footsteps began again, and to the teen's horror, they were coming in his direction. With every echo, he could feel his blood pressure starting to spike and his heart rate drop at the same time. His face grew cold and clammy, while his throat was sucked dry. He had never heard so many curses going through his head before. Shit. He watched, terrified, as the hero walked through the living room and into the kitchen, almost making him exhale in relief as he hadn't been noticed. But that relief never came as he saw the ragged pro move towards the light switch. He gave one last cry to the universe, wishing for it just to erase his existence right then and there. The kitchen light was blinding compared to the darkness that he had been in for the last hour. The white light was invading his eyes and forcing him to be having to squint. Unfortunately, that wasn't the only thing it invaded, as some of the light flooded the living room. Aizawa was noticeably startled when he saw Midoriya's curled-up form on the couch. If it weren't for his skills he had picked up being an underground hero, he would have probably yelled out instinctively. "Holy shit, problem child," he gasped out under his breath. "What are you doing up?" "Well, there's no getting out of this now." I'm sorry, Aizawa-sensei," he whimpered quietly. I just needed to do my job, and I've been in my room all day, and—" Okay, he cut the boy off. "It's fine. You just startled me. I wasn't expecting you to be up about this late." Sorry. You don't need to Aizawa stopped himself as he realized. "Wait. Did you hear my phone call?" I didn't mean to." The high-pitched cry broke his voice near the end. "It was an accident, and I didn't know what to do." He shushed the boy as to not wake up his partner, but he gave a hefty sigh. "It's fine. I'm not mad or anything." "You're not?" he asked to settle the fear in his conscience. "No, problem child," he huffed. "You said it was an accident, and I believe you." The two stared awkwardly at each other, with Gami in the background. He honestly didn't know what to make of the situation, practically giving up for the night. The teacher then dropped his shoulders, almost in defeat. "Well, I was just going to get a glass of water," he started. "But since you're up, I guess I'll make something more complicated." Aizawa pulled out a mug from one of the upper cabinets, settling it down on the counter. He looked towards the curled-up boy on the couch again and sighed. "I'm making hot chocolate," he clarified. "You want some?" Midoriya's head perked up at the mention of the sweet drink. He didn't want to trouble the man, but at the same time he did offer. Oh, the options were conflicting, but when he turned back to look at Gami, all he got in return was a curt nod. Well, that made his decision quite obvious. Who was he to resist such a divine temptation? "Yes, please." All right, everyone, this concludes Chapter 16 of Deku and Death. Chapter 17 will be up next, and as always, thank you all so much for listening.